Jolene, we're so sorry to hear that you have COVID, and pray that you will get better very soon.
Thank you very.
I'm sorry I missed Stephanie as well. Did you have a good visit with her?
We did, and she helped out a whole lot. She cooked for us and put some things in the freezer, and just a delightful visit.
Great. Well, I can hear in your voice that you are congested. I'm so sorry.
Thank you. I'm sorry too.
Oh, gosh. Anything for the good of the whole before we begin? In this, if the second to last chapter is the penultimate chapter, is the last chapter the ultimate chapter? I guess it is, right? Which is different than Ne Plus Ultra, but my brain is going in different directions today. Stephanie was supposed to teach, but she asked, could I teach? Will is gone. Stephanie is overwhelmed, and
very long people coming to stay at my house. I'm adding 5 people and a dog tonight to my house. A 3-person family.
yeah. When you more than double, things get crazy.
And probably like 2 people apiece, like
Yeah.
6'5", 6'6", 6'2", but.
And who's preaching Sunday?
Me.
Yeah, I thought so. I thought, and there's that too. So you have to put up with me today, who is somewhat distracted because I fly out this afternoon to Santa Fe for a wedding this weekend. My cousin, I have such a small family. My cousin Cleo, who is known in the family as Junior because her mother was Cleo. Cleo Junior gave birth to Owen when she was 40, and her husband David was doing his PhD research in Wales. So Owen was born in Wales. Owen is now 41 and just decided it's time for him to get married. He's doing his PhD in Oxford, and his wife is this lovely girl from Yorkshire, whom I adore. But all the Griffiths are gathering in Santa Fe, and then the wedding itself is going to be at Ghost Ranch, which is one of our centers. Lip, have you ever been out to Ghost Ranch? Yeah, it's one of Donovan's favorite places. He was out there painting earlier this year, so we're looking forward to that. Yeah. And I will give you my dad joke book. That is awesome. He doesn't need it. He could write it. Is that what you're gonna say, Mary?
No, the kids have already given him.
Plenty of those. Don't need any more of those. Just a reminder that next week we will not be having class, and would invite folks to go. There'll be announcements in the newsletter and so on. Next week, the Presbytery is meeting over at Second Church, and part of that meeting is Ashley will be examined. We'll have to preach and then be examined for ordination. And if you'd like to come and be part of that, that'd be great. If, on the other hand, you want to wait to hear the sermon that she's preaching at Presbytery, she's going to be preaching on the 11th. So not this Sunday, but next Sunday. And we'll use the same sermon that she preached at Presbytery. But it's been wonderful having her here. Her office looks very different than the rest of us, including there's a little place for children in there. And she's had her 2 daughters with us. Ashley is the new pastor who's joined, Ashley Higgins. And so we're really excited to welcome her and for you all to get to know her as well. Anything else for the good of the whole? All right. I have I'm embarrassed that Will wrote so much for you last week, including 3 great prayer poems, and you're not getting that today. I apologize, but So conclusion, were you surprised by the conclusion? Or did you see that this is where the whole argument was heading?
I was relieved for the conclusion. I
Okay,
needed somebody to bring this together a little bit.
okay. And,
I concur. The conclusion didn't surprise me, but I didn't ever get to the conclusion by reading the book. Yeah, I don't know if that makes any sense. The conclusion made more sense to me than a lot of it did.
okay. I wonder, and it's interesting, I was texting this morning. Some of you might remember a woman I had teach for us twice named Laura Fabricki. Laura wrote an amazing book called The Keys to Bonhoeffer's House. Her husband was a diplomat in Berlin, and she ended up being a docent at Bonhoeffer's house and wrote this, in my mind, absolutely amazing book based on that experience. And I had her back to teach because she's doing her doctoral work in sort of combating ascete, the what we tend to call sloth, the sin of sloth. And her husband has just been posted to Copenhagen as in the embassy there. They moved there yesterday, and I knew she was going at the end of July, so I texted, and she texted me back this morning and wanted to hear our experience with this book, especially what we didn't like about it, because a lot of people in her circle have been talking about it. And I already have a sense of some of the critiques that we've had of the book. But I also want to hear, as we come to the conclusion, what have you thought have been some of the strong points as well? We'll get to that. But it's also interesting that a friend of mine who's the pastor at First Pres Atlanta, a very gifted guy named Tony Sundemeyer, concluded his sabbatical yesterday. And one of the things he did was publish a list of the books he read on sabbatical. And this was one of the books that he read. So it's something that's having some wider conversation. And even though we've had some challenges with it or some critiques of it, I think it's been a worthwhile and important read for us to engage with, right? So, and as we come to this chapter, it's a kind of a full-throated affirmation of liberal democracy, right? And I found myself wondering a little bit, for those who are not in the Western world, how that would settle, right? Serious Christians who are in other places. So.
Well, he sort of says that.
He does say that. He acknowledges that completely, yeah. You know, because it is sort of interesting, having traveled, you know, to Amman, Jordan, when the former King Hussein was there, who had reigned for 50 years and was sort of the sole mark of stability in the Middle East. You know, that wasn't a bad place under the Hashemite Empire. Well, unless you were Palestinian and trying to take over Jordan, then it wasn't so good, you know. So there's all of that. Yes.
I'm reaching the conclusion of it. I mean, I thought it was leading that way, and it's kind of what we all want. But it's quite unrealistic too. It's not like, this is the dream world.
Right. Yeah, I think so. Although, you know, I really, where was it? I've marked up my book so much that I don't know that I'm going to be able to actually read a lot, but liberal democracy stands as the least worst option for human governance, was one. And where was it? This thing is dying on me again. Here it is on page 170. Democracy's strength is that it can sustain diversity. Democracy's weaknesses is that diversity creates conflict, right?
Great one-liners.
Yeah, I do think you're right that there were some things here, but the challenge for that and also the willingness of folks to accept the gift of diversity and to see that. Well, let's just go ahead and jump in. Church and state revisited. Political theology is trying to answer a couple of basic but important questions. Can there be Christian faithfulness in the public realm? If politics refers to our lives as citizens, then what does it mean to be Christian and a citizen of a country, state, a county, state, country, or world? And then Anabaptists and Anglicans, very, very different. But we've taken the affirmative answer to that question. The Christian faith is meant to be a public faith for the common good, which compels us to do good, to make good, and to build good in the private and public endeavors. So the Anabaptist tradition, really, the Mennonites and the others are to completely disengage, right? We're going to live in the Amish communities and withdraw from, whereas the Anglican and Reformed and the others are completely engaged. We're compelled to be Christians for the sake of our multiplicity, state, country, and even the world. The problem is that the world is a difficult and dangerous place, more obviously so in the 2020s than any time since the 1930s, with economic upheaval, wars raging, and visceral political divisions. So if we must ascertain precisely how Christians relate to the state, we need to explore a few items further. In our political theology, we need to ask, how does God's authority relate to the authority of the state? What type of state should Christians support? How should Christians manage differences with the diversity of the state they find themselves part of? So I think in many respects, this first section, God's authority and the authority of the state, is ground that he sort of has already covered, right? That is to say, on a theological account, we could reason that government takes its legitimacy from God. We've talked about that a fair bit in the book. I did think over on 152.
What about that statement on 150 that things are as bad as they've been since the 1920s to 30s? I would have thought people who were in World War II would have argued with that statement.
Yeah, I mean, I thought I'd get pushback from Bob Buchanan on that there's never been a good time. But I wonder if he's talking particularly about the rise of the anti-democratic movement in the 20s and 30s that in fact led to the wars of the Second World War. That was what I was kind of hearing, that the economic upheaval and the response to that in the 20s and 30s that led to the war.
The war began in 1939.
Exactly, right, yeah. And for Germany, we could argue it, started in the mid-30s, right? So.
In the Vietnam War, there was a lot of unrest, riots in the cities with Martin Luther King's. Anyway, I thought that was going a little far.
Yeah, I mean, it would be fair to say, since as I look around the room, many of you are a few years senior to me. What was it like living in 1968? I mean, I can't imagine. I was aware enough as an 8-year-old of how horrible these things, but I mean, you all were college or post-college.
From college, I had an interview at Hopkins Medical School. Took the train down, Princeton to Baltimore and walked up to the medical school. And on top of the nurses regiment was a machine gun.
Yeah.
And a group of military people because of the riots that
Yeah.
just happened. in Baltimore.
Yeah. I mean, I just, and sort of a despair, right? To lose Martin and Bobby, well, and you know, you start January with the Tet Offensive. Right? And then it goes from there, Mark.
Well, it was obviously a time of upheaval, but it feels like it was. In some ways, it almost feels like a Christian-based sort of social movement to remedy some problems
Right.
like civil rights and an unjust war.
Right.
So people were actually in my
Engaged,
mind, actually being engaged and being active, which is
Right.
the way this book sort of calls for. Don't
Right.
just sit on your hands and expect your democracy and everything's gonna go perfect, your leader's gonna do great.
Right.
You need to speak up.
right?
So that's where I saw.
Can I ask you a question?
That's helpful, Mark, yeah.
Can I ask you a question? When John F. Kennedy was assassinated, did everybody feel that? Did everybody feel like their president had been killed?
Yes, I think so.
So 12 years old.
Okay,
But
okay.
I remember when the announcement was made at school, we didn't even have intercoms and we came around and it, yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I just, my parents came and picked me up.
Yeah, yeah.
Everybody just, parents just showed up and picked people up. I'm reading, a book called The Evening Stars, which is, how anchor men and women became that in television. And it's very interesting, but I just finished reading last night the part about Walter Cronkite making the announcement. And it basically said, you know, for the first time ever, the entire nation watched one channel.
Yeah.
4 days, there were no commercials.
Yeah.
And a lot of the book is funding, you know, and where the money came from. And I can't remember how many tens of millions of dollars
Yeah,
CBS lost
yeah,
in having no commercials for 4 days.
yeah.
But then, you know, how that changed down the
Yeah.
road. Super
Ken,
interesting.
you shook your head.
I remember my 10th grade history teacher saying, well, I wanted him out, but not like that.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's not a total.
Exactly. You know, the anti-Catholicism, I think by then had.
Right.
My 10th grade history teacher, I walked into her classroom and she was weeping. And in Memphis, Tennessee, that was a different reaction from yours.
Yeah.
She was weeping, but by then he was our president.
Right.
Fears of, you know, anti-Catholic.
Yeah.
Catholic. I just felt like, you know, oh, well, we're all gonna be, well, no, not really.
It was,
Mary Evelyn, you were gonna say?
I do remember that TV, as I said, I was only 12 years old, but I do remember that. But back to what you were saying about a few years later, like, I was a freshman in college in '69. There's a book out right now called Never Over the Hill. It's about UT during those years. And there's a line in that book that said, at that time, people were getting their Bachelor of Conservative Arts at UT. We were pretty far removed.
Right.
And I'm just gonna say there was no anti-war protest, and I'm reckoning a part of that. She was there then too, but most of us, we weren't touched by that.
Right. Gene?
I'm probably older than most, and I was raising children at that one time. And, yeah, I remember, I was in the car, I remember exactly where I was, on what road, in front of what building I was when I heard it on the car radio. And every time I still pass that spot, it comes back.
Yeah.
yeah.
It just does.
Yeah.
So interesting.
Yeah, and in 68, again, you know, then we had the Democratic Convention in Chicago. And you know, it must have felt like everything was coming apart. And I often say, you know, folks who graduated high school, like pre-65 versus post-65, it seems to me, just working in the church with folks like that, have a very different kind of experience of what college and high school was like and all of that. Mary?
For me, the surreal was when Nixon, okayed bombing in Cambodia.
Yeah,
I was in grad school at the University of Maryland. I was in charge of a dormitory of 121 girls. And tanks came on campus.
yeah,
My dorm was right by the library on the top of a hill with a panorama view. We got tear gas. There were 5 tanks parked right outside my door.
Yeah.
And I had to get on the PA system and get all the girls to gather a certain place. You had to come with towels, wet towels, because the tear gas was so bad, you were burned.
Yeah.
It's just a real experience.
Yeah.
To be in the United States at a big university and.
yeah. I wish Dana Brooks were with us because she was, had a dorm, head of the dorm at Rhodes in '68 when King was assassinated, in a similar kind of situation where tanks were rolling through the streets and, you know, she had to get girls more.
Just to follow up on that, it seems to me that a good bit of the unrest was actually often led by clergy.
Right.
I mean, I think of Casey told me, who was at Rhodes, he was outspoken in
Right.
March for civil
Right.
rights.
Right.
Think of, you know, that just, we had a minister here when I grew up in this church. We had a man named Pat McGee, who was admired greatly. But he was probably a little liberal for this church. And I think at one point, I was out of town at the time, but I heard he said something from the pulpit about, you know, this war, I don't give a damn. Something like that. You probably know the full story, but next thing I wasn't here too much.
Right.
Down to downtown Presbyterian.
Yeah.
But the church, it seems to me, at least that, an element of the church was sort of in some ways more vocal, more leading the charge.
Right.
For social change.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Lib, were you gonna say something?
Remember
I do, and in fact,
civil rights and
Yeah.
how it was powerful.
and in fact, Lib, you'll find this, I don't know if anybody else in the room, but one of the people featured in that movie was a man named John Kirkendall, who later taught religion at Davidson and became the president. And he was paired with, he was the chaplain at Auburn. So the woman who made this movie, and I've got a DVD of it, I'll show it again. She interviewed Southern Presbyterian pastors who had been on the front lines of the civil rights movement and want to capture their stories. And one of the people featured was Knox Walkup's daddy, who was just incredible guy down in Starkville. And John Kirkendall was the chaplain of Auburn, and there was a pastor there Wally Alston, who was the pastor at the Auburn church. And this woman had come out of a family that pretty much taught segregation, and they were a little worried about her going off to this state school that was not just a girls only school. And she encountered Kirkendall and Alston in the church, and it turned her life around, thinking different ways about the world. And she became a documentary filmmaker and made this remarkable film, although she hasn't learned how to edit it to make it feasible for Netflix, right? She wants every story in there. But I ran into John Kirkendall up at Davidson on last week, and it was just so wonderful to see that person. And for me, Mark, part of it was the spirit with which many of them took that. It wasn't always this kind of aggressive, it was just going out and saying, listen, we need to love people. Why aren't we doing that? Yeah.
We may want to think about that period of time in relation to this book in a way. So I agree that the church was involved in some of the unrest with the race, with the assassination, with the war. And I think all of that then led to Nixon's victory in the next election, because he was going to put an end to all the riots.
Right,
and
yeah.
into the demonstrations.
Law and order, right?
Right.
In the emphasis of the church or that some of the leaders made to right some of these wrongs. It also had, I think, some, at least to me, some bad sides. I was a big Hubert Humphrey fan.
Right.
So he had no chance after being involved with the war and with the segregation, they lost all of the South.
Right. Now it's right. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask that because in my lifetime, we've only had near misses of presidential people. Reagan and then most recently Trump.
And Jerry Ford.
Jerry Ford?
Jerry Ford.
I didn't remember, so I was a little young still.
Yeah.
I didn't know that part, but like, it's just been interesting because I always assumed that Kennedy was kind of like the space shuttle and kind of like 9/11, in that everybody sort of had this kind of collective sorrow, collective sadness and fear that happened, but I didn't really know for sure because like what happened with Reagan was so different. We end up with some measure of ammunition control that happened as a result of that. And then with what happened so scary with the rally with Donald Trump, I was so surprised how I was like, this feels like a school shooting. And I was so confused by that. And I was like, have we lost our ability to feel collective sorrow? But anyway, I digress.
It's another thing going on back then too. See, the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62.
Right.
Right.
And see,
Yeah.
Margaret and I are part of that generation, the duck and cover, you know,
Yeah.
your dad's like, that's gonna say.
Yeah.
I'm just like,
It's so interesting. Moms are gonna come in our desks were gonna be protected.
Right.
Kept under the desk.
Right. Bob, were you wanting to say something?
No,
Okay. Are you able to hear the conversation well enough, or should I repeat people?
I'm following it well enough, I guess.
Okay, thanks.
Or it's out of town.
Are you sick or out of town, Bob? People want to know.
We're out of town.
Okay.
Okay,
We're in the northwest corner of Connecticut.
man, what a,
Oh, I was gonna just say, I mean, I'm really valuing this sharing the experiences, and I think today what we have is school children doing active shooter drills, right?
right,
I don't know if that's the same thing, and so, you know, they still do their fire drills and whatnot, but active shooter drills and how wild that must be, but when you put it against, like, did I think a bomb was gonna explode, you know?
Yeah.
And the other thing, with some trepidation, like January 6th.
yes,
When we saw the Capitol attacked.
right,
And that has, I don't think that has brought people together.
Everybody.
The first time in American history.
Right.
Have the Capitol invaded and attacked and, I don't know, I'm kind of throwing it out there because that's sort of a similar. When you talk about tanks on campus. I put that alongside people assaulting officers in the Capitol and. So.
yeah, I mean, we could spend a lot of time talking about the experience of that day.
Right.
My son was getting ready to move to Washington, and he had been working for a congressman from our basement, because he was one of those COVID graduation kids or pandemic. And then worked for a caucus for the House. And I went home for lunch, a late lunch on the 6th, not knowing what was going on. And finding my son in absolute tears as he's getting texts from Congress people he had known working with that are in the House. And then one of my close seminary friends began being a chaplain on January 3rd, and she was in the House. she had retired as chief chaplain of the naval, of Marine Corps and Navy. And she later taught a class for me here and said, you know, the year she spent in Afghanistan gave her ability to kind of deal with what was going on that day. But you're absolutely right. A polarizing experience rather than a unifying experience. Yeah, thank you. All right. Let's go ahead and move on. We've got, you know, it's always good when they quote Calvin. I like that on page 152. The very bottom of 150, the state exists for the purpose of exercising authority, but that authority is derivative, not definitive. If anarchy is one possible problem that government solves, absolutism is the kind of problem government can create. Thought that was helpful. Governing authority is conferred by God and therefore accountable to God. Yet almost nobody today talks as if the state is a divine servant. So then he talks about Christendom and some of the challenges of Christendom over 154 now. The rejection of Christendom as a royal priestly alliance had instant political effects. Instead of God save the king came long live the republic. In the post-Christendom settlement, authority was delegated not from on high, from God to the king, but transmitted from below, from people to public officials. Instead of divine right of kings, we have the voice of the people is the voice of God. Instead of king's law, we have the law as king. In a post-Christian context, whether a communist state or a democratic republic, God does not ordinarily enter into the conceptualization of state authority. We're not convinced that Christian monarchies were the worst system of governance, given their alternatives at the time, or pagan tribal confederation, Islamic caliphates, or being the vassal of Eurasian steppe army. Still, it was not hard to improve upon Christendom. And then at the very bottom, I thought this was helpful. Be that as it may, Western liberal democracies, without the stability produced by a representative monarch or shared meta-narrative, have always run the risk of fragmentation and Republican fratricide. And then he gets into this, you know, notion, I think, about the need to be rooted in some kind of consensus. The bottom or the middle of the top paragraph on 155, without a shared story, we cease caring about the common good or allow our minds to be dulled by endless entertainment. We cease to have the ability to discern truth from lies, or we demand that all opposition is destroyed, even if it overthrows our own freedoms. Without a shared symbol, stories, ideals, goals, and visions of human life together, a liberal democracy can fracture and fragment its freedoms away. Without belief in one who sits above the table of petty partisan squabbles, we are destined to be governed by grifters and torn apart by grievances. What did y'all think about that?
Bill's time.
Yeah.
I thought about it particularly in terms of immigrants coming to the country. And the shared story gets lost. I bet almost every one of us was not a Native American, so we had immigrants at one time.
Right.
Sort of lose the story that your family was part of the immigrant. I'm sure they went through some struggles like the new immigrants, but I sort of lost that after being 2 generations away.
Right. Yeah, and looking at your spouse, knowing how long her people had been in the United States forever. I mean, that always blows me away. I had a friend in my hometown whose people came over on the Mayflower and had furniture from that. I'm like, you know, wait a minute. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's just amazing to me, but your point is so apt, and, you know, part of me would wanna almost put the pause button and say, what is the narrative story? Is that part of it? Is that immigrant experience that we come together? And I mean, how many of us watched the men's gymnastic team?
Yeah.
Delightful.
And the women.
And the women's, but I think particularly about the men, because it was almost like a World War II movie, right? I mean, here's the short Asian kid, here's the African-American kid, here's the, you know, two kids who parents had come as immigrants, and then there's this nerd who does one thing and wins the medal. I mean, it was like, is that who we are? You know, I mean, is that the kind of coming together that we want to talk about as being part of our country? Or are we still saying, well, you know, these people have come, they're less than? And how do we open up the same kind of opportunities? I think especially in an economy that has changed, right? When my grandfather came over, he was a slater. He was a quarryman. He worked in every major slate, granite, and marble quarry in the eastern seaboard, from Poultney, Vermont to Tate, Georgia, until he found a quarry in Slatington, Pennsylvania. How's that for a name of a town? What do you think happens in Slatington, Pennsylvania, where he met my grandmother, and then they moved to Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania? But, you know, it was backbreaking work. Right. In a post-industrial economy, what are the jobs, right? You know, so I think that's one of the challenges we have with all of these people trying to come to America for a better life. But, you know, where are the ramp points? I mentioned before that book I taught a couple of summers ago, or I talked to the book group called Tightrope, and the notion of what are the economic opportunities that we have for folks coming on board? All right. Yeah.
That's a good question. Is there a agreed upon dates for Christendom? Like, is this when Romans adopted Christianity, or what are the parameters of Christendom? Like, did it ever actually, I mean, is that something that actually happened in people's minds? And if so, like when?
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good question. So generally, the start of it is thought when the Emperor Constantine embraced Christianity. And that pretty much was in place until the late 20th century. When I was at seminary, they just started talking about a post-Christendom era, where you know, his experience of England, right, where he talks about the prime minister being Hindu, and the, you know, other person being all of that, where we're not seeing that Christianity is in the privileged position in the state anymore, that there's not the kind of unity. Now, what's interesting in our context, you know, I can't see somebody achieving the high office, and we're already hearing, I think, some conversations about, you know, that Harris's husband is Jewish, and what if there were to be a Jewish person on the ticket with her, and all of those kinds of things. And I remember a couple of years ago, there was a candidate who was running for presidency who was out of New England, and he was trying to make his Christian bona fides. And it was really clear that this man had never once, you know, cracked open the New Testament, kind of a deal. But there's still kind of an expectation of that here. And but I think in Western Europe, for instance, that the sun is sort of set on that cozy expectation that the government and the people are all Christian. In Germany, for instance, the way the church was funded, it used to be tax, and that tax has gone away. So now It's, do you want to pay or not? And folks are saying, no, I don't want to do that. Thanks very much. So I think we can probably date it. I don't know that I have an exact date, but certainly the latter part of the 20th century is where we started talking about post-Christendom as a place. Does that help?
Like Holy Roman Empire, would that be?
Yeah, very much. And then, when the Holy Roman Empire broke apart, still all of those kingdoms that were part of the Holy Roman Empire were still Christian. I mean, one could almost begin to date the falling of it is the First World War. Because all of these, nations involved in that were Christian nations. Why are we, fighting one another when we're Christian brothers and sisters? And beyond that, we're all related to Queen Elizabeth, right? The leaders of those countries. So that begins, I think, the marker of where in Western Europe, there's real questions about the connection of Christianity and the state. Yeah.
Guy,
Yes. Yeah, Bob.
I called your attention a few weeks ago to a David Brooks editorial in the New York Times. And one of the statistics or facts that he mentioned in that editorial was that in the early 1950s, some poll of Americans was taken and asked, would you vote for a non-Christian to be president? And only 11% of those questions said that they would vote for a non-Christian for president. That question has been asked again more recently, and over 60% of those questions said they would vote for a non-Christian to be president. Right. So that shows a big change in our mindset. Right.
I think I mentioned in a previous class, there was a really famous book. I'm not going to recall the name of the author right offhand, but it was Protestant Christian Jew. And it basically said in the 1950s, to be an American, you sort of were in one of those three categories, right? And so I think about the kids that I grew up with who had moved over from Lebanon and were very much, Muslim, but were a very big minority. And I think the real growth that you're pointing to and that Brooks is pointing to is somebody who is not aligned with any of those categories, but in fact has no religion at all, right? It's not just that they would choose somebody who was of a different religious stripe than Christian, but is open to somebody who doesn't make any faith claim at all, right? So, all right. So I do wonder in this, and I'm again at the middle of 55, take heed, no democracy can survive external actors maliciously exploiting its internal fissures without a narrative structure rooted in something beyond itself. And so the question becomes, what's that narrative? And is a sense, or, I remember reading an essay one time, can we be good without God? Is there some sense of an authority outside of ourselves that we need to be attentive to? The Christian story, then here's where he's moving on with his argument, possesses an acute political utility. That was an uncomfortable end of a sentence for me. Acute political utility. In setting forth a story where evil is real, where evil takes the form of empires from Pharaoh to Caesar, where evils, the mundane and the menacing, can also take root in ourselves. The answer to evil is not revenge, but redemption. I thought the writing of that was actually the rhetoric of all of that was really, really good. But as somebody said, maybe it was Margaret, that some of this becomes pretty idealistic as well. For Christians, I'm over on 56 now. The common good is not rooted in whim of mob mentality, slavishly tied to fickle fashions. limited to populism or plebiscites, or even attained and shared goals as banal as live and let live. Authority is from God to the state and meets with consensus of the people. The ultimate sin of government is not against law, tribe, or house, but against the one who wills that government must be governed justly, wisely, and benevolently. And it seems to me that that's, that really is the prophetic stance. Why I so appreciate having you all in my Bible classes read the prophets, because that's what they're holding up, this reminder that you, King, are not God, that there is this other that we all need to call to. I did want to ask a little further down from that, a state authority that knows it is not and never should try to be almighty, combined with a citizenry that aspires to civic virtue. In such a settlement, even with secular constitution, one may appeal to sustained traditions and narrative, such as those supplied by religion, to enable comprehensive suite of freedoms and safeguards against tyranny and anarchy. I wonder if you agree with that.
I think I don't. I think I don't. Because the people who may have grown up around Christianity and who have left it don't trust it. And I think it's going to take something different. Like I tend to believe that as Christians, we have to show ourselves faithful. We don't just show up with authority that is recognized all the time anymore.
Right.
And so we have to show ourselves faithful, because these are people who are familiar with Bible stories. And so if they see us really living that out, that could make a difference for them. But there's a lot of mistrust. I have been astounded with my Facebook page, how many people have said, well, I hear what you're saying, but I'm not a Christian, Stephanie. So I like just make my own little statement. And then they're like, but I'm not a Christian, Stephanie. This doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah.
And I'm like, his choir together at Greenview United Church in the center of Illinois, person. How can you not be a Christian? But like, of course, that's just me having to adjust to the reality. And that person made a faithful statement. And for me as a Christian to take that to heart is important, because we have something, we still have good news. We still have this to show. And the way we're going to show it is by being so faithful to the gospel. And that's what people who at least have been exposed to Christianity are going to recognize as real. Whether they ever become confessing Christians or not, they can at least begin to learn to trust us as being people who say what we believe and live according to it. And then maybe that's something God can work with.
I'm hearing you argue almost for what Bonhoeffer called religious, that we no longer have the right to say anything post-war, but we need to live it out.
We no longer have the right to assume people are going to listen to us. I think there was a time when you could just sort of know you were going to walk in the room and everybody was going to be aware of who the pastors are in the room, and they're going to take turns at who's going to pray for this secular event, and that's going to happen. There was a time when I think as Christians, we could sort of walk in the room and have some authority.
Right.
But I think that we have to recognize the authority as Christ in us and show that forth and make sure that we're not just showing up assuming people need to listen to us. I say as a preacher. It makes everybody be quiet for 20 minutes.
Can I say something?
Yes, Rebecca, you may.
I, back at the beginning, I really found this book helpful on two fronts. One, I won't get into now, but the second is as they talk about liberal democracies. And I realize I'm saying this to a room full of Presbyterians. I'm really not sure what PCUSA thinks about predestination, but I know the conservative predestination and TULIP and all of that is really problematic to me. And so my understanding of everything I've read about God, everything I've learned about God, is that God wants us to freely choose to be in relationship with God. And if you have a government that's coercing that, be it through Christian nationalism or communism, you're not giving God a chance to have an authentic relationship. The field is not clear. So it's not even, I mean, we're in a broken world. No government's going to be perfect. No government's going to be perfect, but the ones that are coercing people into following Christianity are the ones that are suspect. And I mean, I think I'm more of an Arminianism than a Presbyterian, that I see God chasing everybody and everyone. But so that is like my big takeaway. Like there could be some fabulous king somewhere who raises fabulous kids that could be fabulous government somewhere if there's religious liberty. So I found this super helpful. I mean, I don't think we need to make an idol out of liberal democracy. Christ is going to save us, not liberal democracy, but it seems to be the most fertile soil for authentic relationship with God that we've come across. And so realizing that's made it really helpful to me. And I also think that, and my laptop is not charging, so I might disappear. So I'll say my other thing real quick, and then I'll just listen to y'all the rest of the time. I felt like they gave us really clear directions as to how to evaluate government and how we interact in government. It was a few chapters ago, but evaluating behavior. My behavior is I interact in the government and interact protesting the government, or interact challenging the government, or interact supporting the government. Am I being cruel, greedy, or unfair? And is the leader being cruel, greedy, or unfair? Now, for me, I could be wrong. The first two are pretty easy to see. I know when I'm being kind of verbally aggressive. I know when I'm being a little snarky, which is borderline cruel. I know when I'm wanting too much attention. That's greedy. But I guess what I need to be checked on with people that can hold my anger, which there aren't many, and certainly not here. I need people to check me on the fairness. So anyway, that's all I've got.
Thank you, Rebecca. Appreciate that. Let's move on then to the Christian case for liberal democracy. Very bottom of 157, human rights and religious pluralism have their deepest roots in countries formed by missional Protestantism. I'm just going to let that lie for a minute. Not going to challenge that. Liberal in the sense that it regards civil freedoms as an inherent good that should not be subject to limitations unless completely necessary, and is democratic in the sense that voting rights apply equally to all citizens. And then damned with faint praise here, liberal democracy stands as the least worst option for human governance. All right. Anything out of that section? Christianity and liberalism, that very last sentence on 159, our neighbor has permission to be other than us. That's, I think, a really important understanding of what he means by liberal, right? Unless I'm over on 160 now, unless their happiness is to the detriment of our own, our neighbor is free to be who they are, how they are, where they are, whenever they are. Love of neighbor is a way to disrupt hierarchical, grievance-based, identity-oriented ways of assigning status. The natural sequel of love of enemies, and the best way to destroy our enemies to make them our friends, our partners, our neighbors. If we add that the parable of the Good Samaritan, then we recognize that our neighbors who are religiously and ethnically different from us have the same capacity for goodness, love, and mercy that we possess. We choose to affirm the freedom to be different and to accept other people's choices insofar as they are not detrimental to any other good. Liberalism means liberty to love despite our differences. Liberalism prefers generosity over conformity. Liberalism chooses to find goodness in others. What do y'all think of that?
Good in theory, but sometimes tough to take on. I was just thinking about people who own properties and use them as Airbnbs as your neighbor, and I don't have any, but it seems to me that having a party house right next to yours every 2 or 3 weeks could be tough to live with when you've spent a fair amount of money on your house and your neighborhood.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that? Understanding that your neighbor may live in New York City and own this property and renting it out. Is he really your neighbor? And
Right.
I don't have a problem, but I
Right.
see the.
Can imagine the problem, yeah. Trish, were you gonna say something?
Yes. Yeah, it was, I love, I mean, this whole paragraph is like, this is it, because to me, what we're fighting about is accepting other people's choices as long as they're not detrimental to any other good, and people what decide or, having very strong opinions about what's detrimental
Right.
to their own good, and where that boundary is.
Right.
That's, I mean, to me, that's what we're fighting about right now, right?
Exactly, and I remember reading a good bit of Martin Marty's stuff on fundamentalism. And fundamentalism is a category that cuts across religious identity. So, there are fundamentalist Muslims and we all hate them, but fundamentalist Jews are the ones who took out Rabin because he was trying to open up with others, and fundamentalist Christians, demand that you have to believe just this, and the rest is anathema. And so part of me is thinking, well, folks who are unlike me on one side of the aisle, but folks who want to constrain how I am, I have less challenge or more challenge with them. And so how do you keep open to all of that? It's really quite that's what we are fighting about right now. Absolutely.
You're talking about money when you're talking about the house next to yours is a party house.
Right.
It's your the value of your house, and it's connection between money, or is it something? Should it be something that physically hurts you?
Right.
That you stand up against.
Yeah.
Well, there's another side to the Airbnb. I mean, I know somebody who has one attached to his house, an Airbnb. And that place is rocking whenever they have people. But it's in his own house. But the other question that I recently heard that was interesting was that there are people with means who are holding on to houses and using them for income, but not thinking about, because sometimes we just think about what we need to do with an asset, but not thinking about how that may or may not impact the overall health of the economy. If we're a country that does want to have home ownership as a part of the American dream, as a part, people that are holding on to properties and using them for extra income are making it difficult, because that keeps the supply a little lower on what houses are available. And so in a place where people are moving in, we're already gonna have these high prices. And so there are people who are just completely priced out of home ownership. And so, it's interesting because there's always so many different angles to every question. And at what point do we need to think beyond just our own comfort, but also what's good for our neighborhood?
Right. All right, let's move on to Christianity and Democracy, 162. Niebuhr's famous quote, "Man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible, but man's inclination to injustice makes democracy necessary." And this is where he really focuses on the consent of the governed. Over on 163, theologians in the past have recognized that while all power is from God, the legitimation of that authority comes through the people. And the bottom of that paragraph, the vulnerability of democracy to a slide into dictatorship is evident from how Hitler found a way to become the democratically elected chancellor of Germany in 1933, and then fused the office of president and chancellor to become Führer in 1934. Similarly, democracy is only as good as the people and institutions guarding it. And I know for me, that is a watchword in our own season. Liberal democracy is a safeguard against autocracy. I thought this section was particularly helpful. And somebody else maybe was referring to this section as well. Maybe it was what Rebecca was thinking of, but individual rights, universal suffrage and participation, separation of powers, peaceful conflict resolution, economic opportunity and equality, government transparency and accountability, rule of law, and judicial independence, self-critique. Anything out of that I mean, the one that really stood out to me was under number 7, that no one person, even those in power, is above the law. You know, I was raised from the time I was probably at least 10 or 11 until 13, my afternoons before I started working were sitting in the back of my dad's courtroom doing my homework. That was childcare, right? Mother was sick or dead, and so I was dropped off at the back at my dad's courtroom and was trying to do my homework while he was trying cases. And there's such a strong sense that I have had of this rule of law, and that we're all equal under law, that becomes really problematical when that gets abused. Even though we know that it is.
It's such a bedrock to America, to be honest with you. That and voting.
Yeah.
Having a voice.
Yeah.
I mean, when you lose faith in the rule of law, faith in the courts, faith in the judges, you're toast.
Right.
Because now you do head towards anarchy.
Yeah. And when, you know, the Department of Justice can be weaponized. Right. You know, that for me is when the pillars of the earth really start to get shaken.
Pillars of democracy.
Yep.
Self-critique, I just think that's pretty difficult for government to do.
To do what? Self-critique.
Yeah.
Self-critique. I was wrong that, you know, I'm pretty good at that.
Right. Yeah. On 166, the discussion above is admittedly Anglo-Eurocentric. We need to consider how Christians in the majority world have related to governing authorities and note the complicating factors in discrete locations caused by geography, history, colonialism, corruption, tribalism, sectarianism, and religion that determine political infrastructure. Alas, Western liberalism might not be easily indigenized or parachuted into non-Western settings where there is no conception of shared humanity, no tradition of individual rights, no concept of secularity, and no separation of powers. What do you all think about that? Stephanie, you want to say something?
Well, I'm not sure what I want to say, so I will hold my tongue.
When I read this, what comes to mind is
in many years past, Christian mission. We wanted to have Christianity as it was here in Nashville, drop it into China. And how does that work?
Yeah, and even that, it seems to me, is a long game. Because what we found is, the former colonial churches in many places now are their own churches with their own distinctive voices. And, one of the hallmarks of the late 20th century was liberation theology that come out of those post-colonial churches, that were able to sort of critique some of the Christendom and the unity of the church and government, to provide a different view of what the gospel means. But you're right, and I think this notion that we're going to go impose democracy on Iraq or Afghanistan, and what the experience of that has been in the last 20 years. So I was appreciative that he raised that.
South Korea might be the one exception to that. That Christianity is somehow almost, as I understand it, almost predominant in South Korea.
Yes, and quite frankly, Presbyterianism is a real leader of that. What's interesting is one of my professors, and I don't know if you ever got to know him, being up in New Jersey and in the wider orbit of Princeton Seminary, but I studied with a guy named Sam Moffat. When I went to Princeton, I went as a mission major, thinking that my work was not going to be as a local church pastor, but that I would help the mission arm of the denomination in its work. Sam grew up on the mission field. His father was the first Northern Presbyterian missionary into Korea. So he was raised on that field. He later was a missionary in China, had to leave when the revolution happened, and then was president of the largest Presbyterian seminary in the world, which is in Seoul, Korea. And came, and these Koreans would come and almost literally kowtow to him. And he was this soft-spoken, gentle human being. When I think of what I want Amy and I to look like when we're in our 70s, if we get there, I think of Sam and Eileen Moffat, this wonderful, wonderful couple. Sam ultimately wrote the definitive history of Christianity in Asia. And one of the questions was, well, what about China? Christianity is only a small percentage of China, but the raw numbers, right? We're not talking percentages, we're talking raw numbers of people. It's huge. And the role of those underground churches and now the state church. And I'm learning a little bit of this through my work with the Outreach Foundation. And South Korea is sending out missionaries now to places like the United States. There were so many kids at seminary with me who were of Korean descent. And they talk about, we generally talk, Ken, you were talking about your second generation immigrant, right? Your grandparents came, like my grandparents came, we're second generation. I meet Koreans who are maybe thinking about becoming pastors, and they're 0.5 generation. They came here when they were 5 years old. It's this, how do you live in these different cultures? And I think I said probably early on, I have such sympathy for immigrants because hearing my dad talk about what it was like to be a child of immigrants, although they were WASPs, right? But my dad, only Welsh was spoken in my father's home growing up. He didn't hear a sermon in English till he came home from the Second World War. He talked about as a boy taking a Reader's Digest and putting it in the hymnal because he was bored stiff because all the service was in Cymraeg. And then later he wished that he could speak it fluently, right? But, you know, to your point, I still have, even though I never knew my grandparents, that was so imprinted in me. And I have so many relatives still back in the home country that I have real empathy for these new waves of immigrants that are coming in. Anyway, we go far afield here. Over on 167, about halfway through the page, also the Western preoccupation with individual rights and liberty over, say, the common good and combating poverty betrays a hierarchy of values and particular social location, which is neither self-evident nor expedient for every other Christian church in the world. We cannot demand that everyone read Romans 13, remember Christendom, or think about building for the kingdom with a Western mindset. We do well to heed the claim of Eliot to identify any particular form of government with Christianity is a dangerous error, for it confounds the permanent with the transitory, the absolute with the contingent. I think that's really very helpful. I know in my own, sense of the evolution of where we are nationally in politics, there was a book written probably in the late 80s called Habits of the Heart by Robert Bellah, a sociologist, and a number of his students. And it really looked at, Christianity, but in a much wider sense, these currents. And I realized that, I was very much raised with the sense of our commonwealth, our common good, that, this noblesse oblige, that I've been blessed to be a blessing of others. But, then all of a sudden, libertarianism came into vogue. What's good for me? Care about the other, and, all of those kinds of things, and this kind of uncoupling from a commitment to what's the widest good for all, instead of just what's good for me. And so I was appreciative of his raising this notion of individual rights and liberty over the common good. That sort of spoke to me. Over on 68, this is why we must defend our democracies from external interference, nefarious actors, and internal combustion. A study of 20th century history shows that democracies can all too easily denigrate into hubs of racial hatred, oligarchy, plutocracy, crony capitalism, and dictatorships. We must be vigilant against free market fundamentalism that exploits the poor and vulnerable, aggressive militarism that urges us to war, not peace, and escalating authoritarianism that tells us that diminishing our liberty is the only path to safety. Wondered what you all thought about that statement. Middle of the page of 168.
Diminishing our liberty, as in potentially losing the need to vote, which I find a little worrisome.
Very, yeah.
That's not the path to safety.
No. Yeah. And it's not only my liberty to vote, but it seems to me any diminishment of the ability to vote for anybody becomes a real concern. Democracy can atrophy with apathy. Thought that was a good, we were talking earlier about the one-liners. Margaret, were you saying about the one-liners?
That was one.
I thought that was good. And then over on 169, we need to choose truth over tribe, was another one. All right, finally, the case for confident pluralism. What did y'all think about that title, confident pluralism? Was that something that you could embrace, or was a little bit worrisome? Democracy's strength is that it can sustain diversity. Democracy's weakness is that diversity creates conflict. Liberal democracy only works if we find a way of living with differences, dealing with diversity, tolerating others, not begrudgingly, but in a manner that represents people's right to hold their opinion and pursue their social vision. Over at the top of 171, confident pluralism offers a political solution to the practical problem of our differences. Instead of the elusive goal of e pluribus unum, out of many one, it suggests a more modest possibility that we can live together in our manyness. That vision does not entail Pollyannish illusions that we will overcome our differences and live happily ever after. We will continue to struggle with those whose views we regard as irrational, immoral, or even dangerous. We are stuck with the good, the bad, and the ugly of pluralism, yet confident pluralism remains possible in both law and society. Confident pluralism allows genuine differences to coexist without suppressing or minimalizing our firmly held convictions. We can embrace pluralism precisely because we are confident in our own beliefs and in the groups and institutions that sustain them. What do you think about that? Part of it was, I was hearing in that we moved from the metaphor of the melting pot to a tossed salad, right? That, in a salad, the tomato is still a tomato. The lettuce is the lettuce. Amy doesn't want any cucumbers in her salad, but there is these distinct things, but we're still all in a bowl together. I think for many of us who were raised on the notion of the melting pot, shifting to that, we're wondering what's lost, right? But is it possible that there is kind of a narrative? And how does that narrative get articulated and celebrated in such a way that it becomes who we are? Now, I would argue theologically, one of the great celebrations of diversity that's cooked into the canon is Pentecost. When the Spirit falls in Acts, they're not asking all of these Parthians and everybody else to become Jews. They're hearing the gospel in their own language. And it seems to me that at the very central part of Christianity is there's celebration of the differences, not just the sameness, right? And which is why, in a sense, I started with that vision of the men's gymnastics team, right? That, is this something that we can celebrate and latch on to? Or is it such that we all have to be the same, look the same? I don't know if any of you remember I think it was an Amazon ad for Christmas a couple years ago. Y'all remember this? It was a Catholic priest and an imam, a Muslim. And what did they get each other for Christmas? Do you remember that? Mm-hmm. So they end up, they're together and they're sort of old and they're having trouble getting up. And so independently, each orders off Amazon knee pads for the other. And then they, come together to kneel in their prayer. But this ability to say that I care about you for who you are as God's person doesn't have to be just like me. And it is part of what's, again, cooked into this liberal democracy is everyone has value because everyone is a child of God, right?
You remember after 9/11, I think it was on PBS, the film Warriors, came on every night. And the rabbi and the one that points in the mind, he was those Presbyterian minister talking in response to 9/11, trying to help us not go after the one group that we all want to go after. And just, so that was what, was 9/11, 2001.
What?
And I'm thinking, we are in 2024, 23 years later. What happened? I thought we were making strides on diversity and difference in living together. And all of a sudden, in the last 5 years, we realized we're not on the same page at all.
Right.
About valuing difference, valuing others, religious perspective, making room for the other, welcoming the stranger. The first stuff is the heart of the gospel for us.
Right.
All of a sudden, there's one group of Christians saying yes. There's another group of Christians saying, no, I don't want anyone who's different from me.
Right.
And how did we? They're just submerged so deep that, and what? How did we get to this?
Well, the bigger question to me, that's all, what's the way out?
Yeah.
So here we are, 2 minutes left.
Yeah.
Where are we going?
How do we
How are
go
we gonna
forward?
solve it?
You started talking about January 6th, they're in the face of what's anarchy. And we're all just sitting, at least I was like, I can't believe this is happening. This is my building. And all of a sudden, this doesn't look like anything I know, and I don't even know what to do.
Right. And then, as I did a few days later, was driving around there and to see it fenced off.
Yeah.
The entire Capitol fenced off. It was just unbelievable. Janice, you want to say something?
I was just gonna say that I think that we were raised with the idea of living in a melting pot. But we really haven't lived in much of a melting pot. If we think about our neighborhoods, where we went to school, where we went to church, it was more of an idea than a reality, probably for, well, speaking for myself, I think it was. And I think the other thing is, accepting all this, like Margaret said, it's idealistic. And can it really happen? I guess my feeling is until you have had an honest relationship with a person who is truly different than you, it's hard to understand or have empathy for them the way that maybe we should.
Right.
And one of the things that I noticed, and I just think that's really hard.
Right.
And one of the, my son lived in Brooklyn. He lived in a very, very diverse neighborhood. It was the world. And what I noticed is you could walk one block and it was Pakistani, and the next block was Black, and it was everything.
Yeah.
They did not mingle. They didn't mingle outside on their sidewalks. They didn't mingle, I walked all over. So, and I really observed all of that, and they didn't mingle at the playground. And you would have all of these pockets of mothers usually and children. And they kept very much to themselves. The children not so much, but the parents did, certainly. And so until there's a willingness, it seems to me, to really reach out and become a friend of someone who's really different than you.
Right.
It's probably not gonna.
Yeah. And to your point, I'm not sure that we have a prescription on how to get out of this, other than it's worth fighting for the liberal democracy because it gives us the best way to love God and love neighbor. And the challenge then, as you suggest, our willingness to love neighbor, especially that neighbor who is different than us, and maybe the one who owns the Airbnb, but you don't really know because that neighbor's not living there. I mean, it's challenging and complex, but I do think that's helpful. This has been a different book than I thought it would be, and it would probably benefit if Guy read all the books ahead of time and decided, but what I do in the summer is I ask you to read books with me that I want to read. And I'm grateful for it. I think that there are some glowing problems with it, but it was also nice to hear a sustained reason why Christians need to pay attention to what's happening in our democracy, right? That it's worthwhile fighting for. What are we gonna do next? Stephanie has on her table 2 essays that were brought to my attention by Lib, and we'll go ahead and take those up not next week, but the week after. So we're gonna provide essays that you all can read and we can discuss over the next couple of weeks. Does that sound like a plan? Rather than having you buy another book and all of that. All right? Anything else for the good of the whole?
I would just say, I mean, ultimately, our vocation is, regardless of what happens in government, even if it's shit right before our eyes, our vocation doesn't change. It's still love God, love neighbor, love ourselves.
Right.
And build for the kingdom. And I think, that's important to remember too, just in case.
And I love the one text that he quoted in here was out of 1 Corinthians 15. Which is, do not grow weary. No, that's the Galatians text. Where is it? This one in here. For your labor is not in vain. Here it is, on 174. Where is that? So, yet we believe with prophetic fervor and patient endurance that God alone is the world's redeemer. And this redemption comes to us in Jesus by the renewal of the Holy Spirit. Such views does not imply that we should abandon the world to other agency, withdraw from worldly ventures, or even leave everything to God. No, such a view calls us to action because if there is to be a day when God may be all in all, then our energies are quickened, not stifled, so that by emerging task is to get busy in the business of the kingdom, always excelling in the work of the Lord, because you know that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. So, Christian vocation in the world. Be out there and do it. Robert, enjoy your time in Connecticut.
Thank you.
The nutmeg state, isn't that what it is? The nutmeg state? I think it is. Ralph Wheeler, welcome back. How was Mexico?
We don't have a third.
Friends, make sure you have one of each of these. Metaphors for the spiritual life, journey with Jesus.
And I'll go ahead and email, or if I'll make sure that there's an opportunity for those of you who are not here to get copies of that as well. Grace to you and peace all. Let me close in prayer. God of grace and mercy, we come to you on this election day. Grateful to be in a country where we can exercise that privilege. For the blessings of being in a democracy, we are truly grateful. And we pray that it would sustain and remain vital. Grant us your grace as we go this day, and strengthen us in our witness that we might love you and love our neighbor. For it's in Christ I pray. Amen. Amen. Blessings all.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys.